There is a specific kind of silence that only exists at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in the middle of January. A silence so heavy that it feels like the entire world has been buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. I was sitting in my living room with only a small desk lamp for company, nursing a cold cup of coffee and staring at the blue light of my laptop screen while the rest of the neighborhood slept. The heating system in my old house was groaning against the sub-zero temperatures outside, and every time the wind picked up, I could hear the wooden beams of the attic shifting and cracking like breaking bones. I remember thinking how easy it would be for something to happen out here in the suburbs during a blizzard, because even if you screamed at the top of your lungs, the falling snow would just swallow the sound before it ever reached your neighbor's window. That was when I heard the first low rumble of an engine echoing from the end of the street, a sound that should have been comforting because it meant the city was finally sending someone to clear the drifts from our quiet cul-de-sac. I stood up and stretched my aching back, walking over to the frosted glass of the front window to watch the orange strobe light of the plow reflect off the icy trees. As the vehicle drew closer, I noticed that the orange light was missing, and instead, the truck was moving slowly through the darkness with its headlights turned completely off. It crawled along the curb like a predator moving through tall grass, stopping directly in front of my driveway with the engine idling in a deep, guttural throb that I could feel vibrating in my own chest. I pulled the curtain back just a fraction of an inch, my heart beginning to pick up speed as I wondered why a contractor would be working in total darkness during the coldest night of the year. The truck was an older model, rusted and battered, with a heavy steel plow attached to the front that looked more like a weapon than a piece of municipal equipment. I watched, frozen in place, as the driver's side door creaked open and a tall figure stepped out into the biting wind, wearing a heavy thermal coverall and a dark mask that obscured every single one of their features. They didn't head for the back of the truck or look at the snow, but instead, they stood perfectly still for a long minute, staring directly at my front door with a terrifying level of focus. Why would someone be out here at this hour without their lights on? And why were they just standing there looking at my house as if they were waiting for a signal? My mind raced through a dozen logical explanations, trying to tell myself it was just a tired worker or a neighbor I didn't recognize. But those lies died the moment I saw the person reach back into the cab of the truck and pull out a long, heavy iron pry bar. They didn't run, and they didn't sneak. They simply began to walk up my driveway with a slow, deliberate pace that suggested they knew exactly what they were doing and that they weren't afraid of being caught. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, jagged gasps that seemed too loud in the empty room, and I fumbled for my phone on the coffee table with trembling fingers. I hit the side button to wake the screen, but the low battery warning flashed red before the device went completely dark, leaving me standing in the shadows with no way to call for help. I heard the heavy thud of boots stepping onto my wooden porch, followed by the sound of the metal pry bar scraping against the door frame. A slow and agonizing sound that set my teeth on edge. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore, because they knew the sound of the idling truck engine would mask the noise of the breaking wood to anyone else on the street. I realized then that my back door was the only exit, but to get there, I had to cross the kitchen, which had a massive bay window that looked out onto the side yard. If I moved now, would they see my shadow against the wall? Or would the darkness be enough to hide me while I made a run for the freezing night air? I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling across the hardwood floor while the sound of the pry bar intensified, followed by a sickening splintering noise as the deadbolt began to give way under the pressure. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to move slowly, keeping my head low as I passed the kitchen window and reached for the handle of the basement door instead. I knew that if I went out the back door, I would be trapped in the deep snow of the backyard with nowhere to hide, but the basement had a small coal chute window that led out to the side of the garage. I slipped into the darkness of the stairs just as the front door finally groaned and burst open, the sound of the wind rushing into the house like a cold, vengeful spirit. I heard the heavy boots step onto the carpet, moving with a heavy, rhythmic thud that told me the intruder was now standing exactly where I had been sitting just moments ago. I held my breath until my lungs burned, listening to the sound of drawers being opened and furniture being shoved aside as they searched the ground floor for any sign of life. The basement was freezing, the scent of old dust and damp concrete filling my nose as I navigated the familiar space by touch alone, heading toward the small rectangular opening near the ceiling. I could hear the intruder moving toward the kitchen, their footsteps echoing on the tile directly above my head, and I knew it was only a matter of seconds before they noticed the basement door was unlatched. I climbed onto an old wooden crate, the wood groaning under my weight, and I reached up to the latch of the coal chute window, praying that the ice hadn't frozen it shut from the outside. I pushed with everything I had, my shoulders straining against the heavy metal frame, until finally, the seal of ice snapped with a loud crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. I didn't wait to see if they heard me. I hauled myself up into the narrow opening, the jagged edges of the metal frame tearing at my sweater and scratching my skin as I squeezed through the gap. I tumbled out into the snow, the sub-zero air hitting my face like a physical blow, and I scrambled to my feet, staying low to the ground as I rounded the corner of the garage. The truck was still idling in the street, its exhaust pipes spitting out thick clouds of white vapor that drifted through the air like ghosts in the moonlight. I realized that the driver had left the keys in the ignition, the engine purring with a steady rhythm that offered me the only chance of escape I had left. I ran through the deep drifts, my socks soaking through and my toes turning numb within seconds, but the adrenaline was pumping so hard that I barely felt the sting of the frostbite. I reached the driver's side door and yanked it open, throwing myself into the cab and slamming the lock down just as I saw the figure emerge from my front door, the pry bar still gripped in their gloved hand. They saw me in the driver's seat and began to sprint down the driveway, their boots kicking up sprays of snow as they realized their own vehicle was being stolen. I jammed the shifter into drive and slammed my foot onto the gas pedal, the heavy tires spinning for a terrifying second before they finally caught traction on the ice and launched the truck forward. I didn't look back until I was 3 blocks away, my hands shaking so violently on the steering wheel that I could barely keep the massive vehicle in the center of the road. I drove straight to the police station in the next town over, the heater of the truck finally beginning to blow warm air against my frozen face as the sun began to peek over the horizon. The police later found my house completely ransacked, but the person was gone, leaving behind nothing but a set of tire tracks and a broken door frame. I never found out who they were or why they chose my house that night, but now, every time I hear the sound of a snowplow in the distance, I find myself checking the locks and standing far away from the windows until the sound fades into the January night. January is a month that demands a certain ritual from those of us living in the northern states, a repetitive and freezing dance of scraping ice and waiting for engines to breathe life into the frozen morning air. It was a Friday night, nearing 11 o'clock, and I was finishing up a late shift at the local library where the silence of the books usually offered me peace. But that night, the silence felt heavy and expectant. I stepped out into the parking lot and was immediately met by a wall of air so cold that it felt like tiny needles were stitching my lungs shut, a deep sub-zero chill that had turned the previous day's sleet into a thick, crystalline armor over my old sedan. I did what I always do on these bitter nights, which was to start the engine, turn the heaters to the highest setting, and then retreat back into the heated vestibule of the building for 5 minutes to let the defrosting vents do the hard work for me. I stood behind the glass of the library doors, watching my car sit alone in the middle of the empty, salt-stained parking lot, the exhaust plumes rising in thick white pillars toward the black sky. There were no other cars nearby, and the streetlights were flickering with a sickly yellow hum that made the shadows of the nearby pine trees look like long, skeletal fingers reaching across the asphalt. I remember feeling a strange sense of vulnerability, a lingering question in the back of my mind about whether I had remembered to lock the doors after starting the ignition, but I brushed it off as late-night paranoia brought on by exhaustion. After all, who would be out in this weather, and what reason would anyone have to approach a beat-up car in a well-lit lot during a deep freeze? When the 5 minutes were up, I pulled my scarf tight around my face and hurried across the ice, my boots making a sharp, rhythmic sound that seemed to echo off the brick walls of the library. I reached the car and yanked the driver's side door open, feeling the immediate wave of artificial warmth hit my skin, which was a welcome relief from the biting wind that was now howling through the light poles. I settled into the seat and pulled the door shut, the heavy thud of the latch providing a false sense of security that I would soon realize was a total illusion. As I reached for the gear shift, I noticed something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, a small detail that didn't fit the reality of a car that had been empty for the last 5 minutes. The interior windows were clear of frost, but the air inside felt heavy and humid, as if someone had been breathing in the confined space for a long time, and the faint scent of wet wool and stale tobacco was lingering in the air. I looked over at the passenger seat, expecting to see nothing but my gym bag, but my heart stopped when I saw that the seat was adjusted much further back than I ever kept it. My eyes drifted down to the floor mat, and there, in the dim glow of the dashboard lights, I saw a fresh, dark puddle of melted snow that hadn't been there when I left the car. It was a small pool of water, still shimmering, and it was trailing from the edge of the seat toward the back of the car, as if someone had stepped inside and then moved out of sight. A cold dread washed over me, a feeling so intense that it felt like my blood had turned to slush in my veins, and I slowly, ever so slowly, tilted my rearview mirror toward the back seat. I expected to see a face or a weapon or at least a shadow, but the back was empty, or at least it appeared to be at first glance. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. But then I noticed the edges of the heavy moving blanket I kept in the trunk for emergencies. The blanket was no longer folded neatly against the back of the seat, but was instead piled into a thick, irregular mound on the floorboards behind my seat, and I could see the unmistakable rhythm of a slow, shallow breath moving the fabric up and down. I didn't scream, because my throat felt like it had been clamped shut by an invisible hand, and I knew that if I made a sudden move, the person under that blanket would be on me before I could even reach for the door handle. I forced myself to keep my eyes on the road ahead, acting as if I hadn't seen anything, while my mind raced through every possible scenario to get out of this alive. If I jumped out now, would they catch me on the ice? Or would they take the car and leave me stranded in the sub-zero darkness where the cold would kill me just as surely as a blade? I realized my only hope was to drive toward the 24-hour gas station 3 miles down the road, a place where there would be cameras and witnesses and bright, unforgiving lights. I put the car in gear and began to pull out of the lot, my hands trembling so violently on the steering wheel that I had to grip it until my knuckles turned white. Every time I hit a bump in the road, I could hear a soft rustle from the back seat, the sound of the moving blanket shifting as the intruder adjusted their position. Why hadn't they attacked me yet? And what were they waiting for in the suffocating darkness of that back seat? Were they waiting for me to get onto the highway where I couldn't jump out? Or were they simply enjoying the terror they knew I was starting to feel? The questions were like poison in my mind, building a tension so high that I felt like I was going to lose consciousness. As I drove, I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of a hand reaching out from under the heavy fabric, while the heater continued to blast hot air into the cabin, making the scent of the intruder even more stifling. We were halfway to the gas station when I saw a pair of headlights appearing in the distance behind me, a sight that should have been a relief but only added to the feeling of being trapped between two threats. The intruder must have realized we were heading toward a populated area, because the mound of blankets suddenly shifted with a violent jerk, and I saw a pale, thin hand emerge from the folds, reaching for the back of my headrest. I didn't think, I just acted on pure, raw instinct, and I slammed my foot onto the brake pedal with everything I had, sending the car into a controlled skid on a patch of black ice. The sudden deceleration threw the intruder forward, their head hitting the back of my seat with a sickening thud that gave me the 2-second window I needed to survive. I fumbled for the door handle, pushed it open, and threw myself out of the moving car, rolling across the frozen asphalt and feeling the skin tear away from my palms as I skidded toward the ditch. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my knees, and I ran toward the woods that lined the edge of the road, the sub-zero air burning my throat as I gasped for air. I turned back just in time to see the figure emerge from the car, a tall, gaunt man with sunken eyes and a jagged scar across his chin, looking around wildly in the darkness. He didn't chase me into the woods, perhaps knowing that the cold would do his work for him, or perhaps he was just looking for a way to disappear back into the night. He climbed into the driver's seat of my car and sped off, the taillights disappearing into the swirling snow like two red eyes fading into the void. I spent the next hour huddling against the trunk of a fallen tree, trying to keep my extremities moving so I wouldn't succumb to hypothermia, until a passing snowplow saw the tracks I had left on the road. The driver found me nearly frozen blue, my body shivering so hard that I couldn't even tell him my own name for the first 10 minutes. The police found my car abandoned in a snowbank 10 miles away the next morning, but the man was never found, leaving behind only the damp moving blanket and a single, rusted pocket knife on the floorboard. I still have to drive that car every night, but I never start it and walk away anymore, because I know that in the month of January, the cold isn't the only thing looking for a way to get inside. The wind was howling through the empty streets of the suburbs like a wounded animal, and the temperature had dropped so low that the moisture from my own breath was freezing into tiny ice crystals on the collar of my jacket. It was the third week of January, the kind of night where most sensible people are tucked away under heavy blankets with the heater cranked up. But I was still out there, white-knuckling the steering wheel of my rusted delivery van because I needed the extra holiday overtime pay. The GPS on my dashboard flickered against the darkness, its mechanical voice directing me toward the very edge of the county line, an area where the streetlights were spaced further apart and the houses were hidden behind long, unplowed driveways. I pulled the van to the curb in front of a massive Victorian-style home that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint since the 90s, its windows dark and empty like the eyes of a skull. I remember looking at the delivery notes on my screen, which simply read, "Leave on porch, do not ring bell, door is open," a request that sent a small ripple of unease through my stomach because it felt so out of place in such a secluded area. I stepped out of the van, my boots sinking deep into the fresh powder that had accumulated over the ice, and the silence of the night was so absolute that I could hear the faint, metallic ticking of my engine cooling down behind me. I grabbed the heavy cardboard box from the sliding door, the weight of it shifting awkwardly in my arms, and I began the long trek up the walkway toward the looming shadow of the house. As I got closer, I noticed that there were no footprints in the snow leading up to the porch, which meant that no one had entered or exited this house since the blizzard began 6 hours ago. The porch light was burnt out, leaving the entryway bathed in a dim, grayish moonlight that made everything look distorted and strange. I reached the top step and set the package down, but my eyes were immediately drawn to the front door, which was standing ajar by about 3 inches, allowing a thin sliver of yellow light to escape from the hallway inside. I stood there for a second, my breath hitching in my throat, wondering if I should just leave the box and run, or if I should check to see if the elderly resident had perhaps fallen or left the door open by mistake in the freezing cold. Curiosity is a dangerous thing on a January night, and before I could stop myself, I reached out a gloved hand and pushed the door just a little further, the hinges letting out a long, low moan that seemed to echo through the entire house. "Hello? Is anyone home? I have your delivery?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile against the heavy stillness of the interior. There was no answer, but I could hear a strange, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere deep in the back of the house, like a heavy heart beating against the floorboards. I took one step inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light of the hallway, and that was when I saw it. A trail of dark, wet smears led from the kitchen door all the way to the cellar stairs, and standing next to the railing was a man I didn't recognize, wearing a dirty reflective vest that looked just like mine. He wasn't a resident, he was waiting, and the realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest when I saw the heavy roll of industrial duct tape and the zip ties hanging from his belt. I backed away instantly, my heart hammering so hard against my ribs that it felt like it might burst, but as I turned to run back out the door, I saw a second shadow moving across the porch outside. They had been waiting for me to step inside, a coordinated trap designed to snatch a lone driver off the streets during the one time of year when no one is looking out their windows. I didn't have time to think, so I dived toward the living room, sliding across the dusty hardwood floor and ducking behind a heavy velvet curtain just as the front door was slammed shut and the deadbolt was thrown into place. I heard the two men communicating in low, hushed tones, their voices cold and professional, talking about me as if I were nothing more than a piece of cargo they needed to secure before the plow trucks came by. I was trapped in a dark room with no exit other than the windows, but the old Victorian windows were painted shut and reinforced with heavy wooden shutters to keep out the winter chill. I could hear their footsteps approaching the living room, a slow and deliberate pace that suggested they knew I had nowhere to go and that they were in no hurry to finish the job. I reached into my pocket and found my box cutter, the small blade clicking into place with a sound that felt tragically inadequate against two grown men, but it was the only leverage I had. I looked around the shadows of the room, my eyes searching for any gap in the walls, and I noticed a small service elevator, a dumbwaiter, built into the corner of the chimney stack. It was a tight fit intended for laundry or firewood, but I was lean and the adrenaline was giving me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I squeezed myself into the small wooden compartment just as the living room door creaked open, and I pulled the manual rope with everything I had, feeling the pulleys groan as I ascended into the dark shaft. I could hear them entering the room below, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, the beams of light passing through the cracks in the dumbwaiter door like tiny searchlights. They were swearing now, confused by how I had vanished so quickly, and I heard one of them head toward the kitchen while the other stayed behind to check the closets. I reached the second floor and tumbled out into a small, freezing servants' quarters, the air even colder up here where the wind rattled the shingles on the roof. I knew I couldn't stay in the house, so I looked for the only way out that didn't involve the ground floor, which was the small decorative balcony that overlooked the driveway. I crept across the room, my socks silent on the floorboards, and I eased the balcony door open just enough to slip out into the biting January wind. The drop was nearly 15 feet, and the ground below was a treacherous mix of hidden ice and frozen garden rocks. But I knew that staying in that house meant a fate far worse than a broken leg. I climbed over the railing, hanging by my fingertips for a heartbeat while the wind whipped my hair into my eyes, and then I let go. I hit the snowbank with a sickening thud, the air being driven from my lungs as I rolled down the embankment toward the street. I didn't stop to check for injuries. I just scrambled to my feet and ran toward my van, which was still idling at the curb, its headlights cutting a path through the falling snow. I dived into the driver's seat, jammed the vehicle into gear, and floored it just as the front door of the house burst open and the two men came charging down the steps. I drove for miles without looking back, my hands shaking so much that I almost slid off the road twice, until I finally saw the blue and red lights of a patrol car at a gas station. When the police returned to the house an hour later, it was completely empty, the men and their gear gone as if they had never been there at all. They found the package I had delivered, but when they opened it, they found nothing inside but heavy bricks and old newspapers, a lure designed to bring a driver to that specific porch. I quit my delivery job the very next day, because now, whenever I see a door standing slightly ajar in the winter twilight, all I can think about is the sound of those zip ties and the cold, dark hallway waiting for me to step inside.